The hammer rang against cooling steel, and Clayton Sawyer did not look up when the door to his forge blew open. He was 3 hours into a sword commission for a coastal merchant who would never use it in a real fight. A decorative piece with a fuller channel and a crossguard shaped like a diving sea hawk, and the metal was at exactly the right temperature for the final draw. Whatever emergency had flung that door open could wait 30 seconds. He struck twice more, turned the blade, struck again, and only then plunged it hissing into the quench tank before he lifted his eyes. Yash Frostwolf stood in the doorway of his forge like a storm had walked in on 2 legs. She was taller than any woman he had seen in Coldspire's little settlement of 300 souls, taller than most men too, with the broad shoulders and dense muscle of her kind, built for a world that never stopped trying to kill you. Her skin was the deep gray-green of sea glass, her eyes a pale amber that caught the forge glow like 2 lit coins, and her dark hair was pulled back from her face with a leather cord that had a single white fox-tooth hanging from it. She wore warrior's leathers that had been cut and fitted with real care, a close-fitted bodice of darkened leather laced up the front with rawhide cord, a short layered skirt of overlapping hardened plates over fitted trousers that were tucked into knee-high boots with iron buckles. The bodice bore faint etched markings along the collar that he did not recognize as any clan script he knew, and a long knife rode her left hip in a scarred sheath. She was, objectively, the most striking person Clayton had ever seen in the doorway of his forge, and he had owned this forge for 6 years. She looked at him like she was deciding whether he was worth her time. "You are the bladesmith," she said. It was not a question. "I am." Clayton set the tongs down on the anvil. "Clayton Sawyer, and you would be Yash Frostwolf." She stepped inside without being invited, which he found he did not mind. "I was told you are the finest smith on this coastline." "I was told the same thing," he said. "I'm the only smith on this coastline, so the bar is what it is." One dark eyebrow rose. Her tusks were short, elegantly curved, ivory white against the color of her lower lip, and he noticed because he was only human and she was standing 3 feet away looking like a carved figurehead off the prow of some great ship. "I need 2 axes," she said. "Fighting axes, not decorative, not ceremonial. Something that will take a real edge and hold it." "Forging time on a pair of matched fighting axes is about 3 weeks," he said. "I have 2 commissions ahead of you, 6 weeks total. Materials are extra and I require half the fee up front." "I will pay the full fee up front," she said, "if you move me to the front of the line." He looked at her for a moment. There were practical reasons not to. There were also practical reasons to say yes to a full upfront payment from a woman who clearly knew exactly what she wanted. He had rent on the forge building, materials to reorder, and a leak in the roof of the small keep quarters above the smithy where he lived that had been dripping on him for 2 weeks. "Done," he said, and reached for the order ledger on his workbench. "I'll need to know the weight, the haft length, the intended use. Are these for war or for hunting large game?" "War," she said without hesitation. He wrote it down. "Single bit or double?" "Single." "I want them heavy at the head, weighted for power strikes, not throwing. The halves should be long enough for 2-handed grip but short enough to swap to one hand if I need the other free." He looked up from the ledger. "You know what you want." "I always know what I want," she said, and the amber eyes held his for just a moment too long before she looked away at the swords hanging on the wall rack. He felt that look like a coal dropped on his skin. Coldspire Keep had not originally been a keep in the military sense. It had been a monastery once, built by some old order of sea-watching monks 300 years ago on a jut of cliff above a rocky cove, with a long hall, a bell tower, and several outbuildings. The monks were long gone. Over the decades, settlers had moved in, built up the outbuildings, and now the settlement was a working community of fishermen, traders, a chandler, a tanner, 2 taverns, and Clayton's forge, which occupied what had been the monastery's old scriptorium before someone had knocked out the back wall and installed a proper chimney. The main hall had become a meeting hall and unofficial tavern. The cliff dropped 60 feet to the sea on the south side. The road in from the north was the only reliable way in or out overland. It was, in other words, defensible, which was why Yash Frostwolf had chosen it. He learned that over the next 2 days, not from her directly, but from the whispers that rippled through Coldspire with the nervous energy of a lit fuse running toward powder. The Frostwolf clan was fractured. There had been a betrayal, her second. A warrior named Drath Ironmaw had spent 6 months building a secret alliance with the rival Stonecliff clan, feeding them Frostwolf troop positions, supply routes, and the locations of their winter caches. When Yash had discovered it, Drath had fled to the Stonecliff war camp rather than face her, and now the Stonecliff chieftain, a brutish older orc named Korek, was using Drath as a political weapon, claiming that Yash had driven her own second to defection through cruelty and incompetence, and positioning Drath to challenge her formal claim to the Frostwolf chieftainship in what the orcs called a blood right standing. Under the old laws that both clans still honored, a blood right challenge had to be answered on acknowledged ground. Yash had chosen Coldspire's flat courtyard as that ground because it was neutral, because the human settlement made it difficult for Korek to pack the audience with Stonecliff warriors, and because she needed time to prepare. She had brought 11 of her most loyal fighters with her, and they had camped in the eastern courtyard beside the old bell tower, and the 300 residents of Coldspire were currently engaged in a low-grade panic about what it meant to have a disputed orc succession fight playing out on their doorstep. Clayton found out the specifics from Marit, the woman who ran the Hall Tavern, who told him everything while slamming a mug of grain ale down on the bar with the kind of energy that suggested she had been waiting for someone new to tell. "She came and spoke to Alderman Horick this morning," Marit said. "Very formal, very polite, paid him 2 silver for the use of the courtyard, didn't ask for anything else. Horick's half terrified and half in love with her, which is fair. But the Stonecliff lot are supposed to arrive in 10 days, and Korek has apparently sent word that if Yash doesn't meet the challenge formally, he'll declare her line ended and absorb the Frostwolves by default." "How does that affect us?" Clayton asked. "Because if Korek absorbs the Frostwolves, his territory border moves to within 2 miles of this coastline," Marit said grimly. "And Korek is the kind of chieftain who taxes fishing boats with swords." Clayton drank his ale and thought about that. He had the axes to finish. He worked on them for 4 days straight, longer hours than he normally kept, because the work interested him and because, if he was honest, there was something about getting those axes right that felt important in a way he could not entirely articulate. He sourced good steel from his reserve stock rather than the cheaper coastal iron, drew the heads out long and slightly curved at the beard, ground the edges to a geometry he had developed himself over years of experimentation, and fitted the hafts with a wrapped grip he had learned from an orc trader who had passed through 3 years ago, a cross-wrap of leather that swelled slightly at the balance point, so the weapon could be swapped hand to hand without regripping. On the 5th day, Yash appeared at the forge door again. This time it was late afternoon and the light was coming in sideways, all amber and salt haze from the sea, and she leaned in the doorway and watched him work for a long time before he acknowledged her. "Progress?" she asked. "Come look," he said. She crossed the forge floor with a quiet that large people rarely achieved, and he set the first rough-finished axe on the work table beside the second. She picked up the first one in her right hand without asking permission and turned it slowly, checking the hang, the weight distribution, the way it sat in the palm. "The grip is iron song-style wrapping," she said, surprised. "Orc trader taught me. I adapted it slightly." He watched her hands on the haft. Her grip was absolutely correct, thumb pressure, wrist angle, everything right. She knew exactly what she held. "The edge isn't final yet. 2 more days." She set it down and picked up the second. She was standing 2 feet from him and the scent of her was wood smoke and something slightly mineral, like rain on heated stone, and it was not an unpleasant combination. "They are good," she said, with the particular directness of someone who does not give empty compliments. "Better than I expected. Better than you expected or better than you hoped? She looked at him sideways. Do you always talk back to customers? Only the ones who seem like they can handle it. Something shifted in her face then, not quite a smile but close to one, a slight release around the eyes and the corner of her mouth, and it made her look younger than the chieftess bearing usually allowed. Finish them, she said, and when they are done I would like to buy you a drink. The ale here is adequate. I'll be done in 2 days, he said. I'll find you. She left the axe on the table with the care of someone who respects a craftsman's work, and walked out into the salt wind evening. And Clayton stood in his forge and recognized, with the quiet accuracy of a man who has lived alone long enough to know his own heart, that he was in some degree of trouble. He delivered the axes on the evening of the 7th day. The Frostwolf camp was a neat, disciplined arrangement of hide tents and fire rings in the eastern courtyard, and the 11 warriors gave him the kind of look that said outsider clearly but not yet hostility, which was better than he had expected. Yash was sitting on an upturned crate sharpening a short sword with a whetstone when he came in, and she stood when she saw the axes wrapped in oilcloth under his arm. She unwrapped them in front of her warriors, and there was a silence and then several low sounds of approval that he understood were positive even without the language. Perfect, she said. Not good, not adequate, perfect. She looked at him across the firelight, and the amber in her eyes was all the more vivid for it. Drink now. You earned it. Yes. They sat apart from the camp, on the old stone wall at the edge of the courtyard where the cliff began its drop to the sea, with a bottle of dark coastal spirit she produced from somewhere, and the night around them was all wind and salt and the distant crash of water on rock 60 feet below. Tell me about the challenge, he said, because it seemed the thing she needed to talk about, and because he was genuinely curious. She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark water. Then she said, Drath was with me for 4 years. He was not a fool and he was not weak. I trusted him with things I trusted no one else with. She took a drink from the bottle. That is the part that is difficult to name in front of others, not that he betrayed me, that I didn't see it. Did you suspect him at any point? There were small things, she said, small enough that I told myself they were nothing. She passed the bottle to him. I have learned something from this. Small things are rarely nothing. No, he agreed. They rarely are. She turned to look at him. The wind moved a strand of hair across her cheek and she did not push it away. You are not what I expected either, she said. When they said the only bladesmith was a human on his own, I expected someone who would overcharge me and underdeliver. I overcharge sometimes, he admitted. But I never underdeliver. There it was again, that almost smile coming from somewhere behind the warrior's composure. How long have you been here, at this place? 6 years. I came up the coast after my apprenticeship ended and my master retired. I saw the forge building and it needed work, but the price was right and I liked the cliff. He looked out at the black water. I like the sound of the sea at night. It keeps the silence from getting too quiet. She was looking at him. He could feel it. You live alone, she said. I do. So do I, she said, in the sense that matters. He looked back at her and they were close on the stone wall, the bottle between them, the sea roaring below, and the space between them felt charged in a way he had not felt with anyone in a very long time. She did not look away and neither did he, and finally she leaned forward and kissed him with a directness that was absolutely consistent with everything he had learned about her in the past week. No hesitation, no half measure, just a clear declaration of intent pressed against his mouth, warm and deliberate, tasting of dark coastal spirit and wood smoke. He kissed her back, which she seemed to approve of, because she made a low sound against him and her hand came up and curled into the front of his shirt and held on. The wind off the sea was cold and it did not matter even slightly. When she drew back, she looked at him with those amber eyes at close range and said, I wanted to do that since the first day in the forge. I was going to do it eventually, he said. I'm just slower about these things. I know, she said, not unkindly. I did not want to wait. He laughed, which surprised him, and she watched him laugh with an expression on her face that was careful and warm and a little bit wondering, like she was memorizing something. He thought that was possibly the most affecting thing that had ever been directed at him. The next 3 days were a shifting, charged thing, a partnership that had not been formally agreed to, but had somehow settled into place like a key finding a lock. During the days he worked the forge, and she drilled her warriors in the courtyard, and he could hear the rhythm of their training through the forge walls, the impact of wood practice weapons, the calls of her voice setting cadence, clear and authoritative and carrying over everything. At meals in the hall she sat with her warriors, but her eyes found his across the room with a regularity that Merritt noticed and found delightful. In the evenings she came to the wall above the cliff, and he came too, and they talked. He told her about the strange meditative quality of metalwork, the way the thinking part of his mind could empty out while his hands knew what to do, and how he had found that useful during years of his life that had not been easy in ways he did not fully specify. She told him about the Frostwolf clan's history, how her mother had unified 3 smaller bands under one name, how Yash had inherited the chieftainship at 24 when her mother died in a fever the winter before last, how the first year had been nothing but proving herself to people who had loved her mother and were not yet sure about her. "How old are you?" he asked one evening. 26, she said. "You?" 29. She considered this acceptable. "Glad I passed inspection," he said, and she bumped her shoulder against his in what he was coming to recognize as a form of physical affection. She expressed through contact rather than performance, and he liked it very much. On the 3rd night she stayed. He did not plan it and he did not push it. She walked with him back to the keep door after the wall, and at the threshold she looked at him with a directness that was its own kind of question, and he held the door open without saying anything, which was its own kind of answer. They were both adults who had spent enough time alone to know what they wanted, and what they wanted was each other's company, and they were honest about all that it encompassed. What followed was warm and unhurried and deeply real, not frantic, not performative, but the kind of intimacy that comes from 2 people deciding to be genuinely present with each other without armor or pretense. He found that she was, under the commander's bearing, both tender and startlingly funny, prone to dry observations at precisely the wrong moments, and that she watched his face with the same intensity she brought to everything, as if she was reading something important there. He found that she was not accustomed to being cared for, and that she allowed it from him with a care that moved him. He fell asleep with her hair loose across his shoulder and the sea wind coming through the open shutter, and when he woke in the gray morning she was already awake, lying still with her eyes on the ceiling, and when she heard him stir she turned and looked at him and said nothing for a moment, just looked, and then she said, "Good morning," in a voice completely stripped of the chieftess register, soft and direct and only for him. "Good morning," he said. She was back in the courtyard by the time the forge fire was lit, and he went to work as if the world was exactly as it had always been, except that it was not. The Stonecliff delegation arrived on the 9th day. There were 20 of them, which was technically within the agreed limit of a formal challenge party, but at the upper end of that limit, and they rode in through the north gate in the hard late morning light, with the deliberate presentation of people who wanted to impress. Korik was at their center, a broad, heavy-set orc of perhaps 50, with a shaved head and a scar that ran from his left ear down to his jaw, and a bearing that said he had been important for a long time and expected everyone to already know it. Beside him, a half-step back and to the right, was Drath Ironmaw. Clayton saw Yash see Drath from across the courtyard. He was standing at the forge door with a piece of rough-finished iron in his hand, watching the arrival, and Yash was 50 feet away near the bell tower with 3 of her warriors, and the distance was enough that he could read her posture more easily than he could have up close. She went very straight, not tense exactly, not in the way that signaled immediate action, but something in her went precisely still, like a blade at rest that is not at all confused about what it is. She watched Drath with eyes that were not angry. They were something quieter and more final than angry. Drath saw her looking and looked away first. Good, Clayton thought. The formal arrangement was this. The Bloodright challenge would be issued the following morning at dawn in the main courtyard, with the settlement's alderman serving as witness alongside 3 warriors from each side. The challenger Drath, acting on Korek's backing, would name the terms. Yash would respond. They would fight. The winner took the Frostwolf claim. The loser either died or forfeited. It was old law and everyone present understood it. What made the current situation complicated was that Drath, by Stonecliff customs, was entitled to name a champion, meaning he did not have to fight Yash himself. He could designate a proxy fighter. And Korek had brought with him, as part of his 20, a warrior named Breck whose reputation had preceded him to Coldspire 2 days early by way of a fisherman who had been at a Stonecliff trading post 3 weeks prior. Breck was apparently enormous. Breck had won 14 formal duels. Breck ate nails for breakfast and sharpened his teeth on river stones, or at least those were the kinds of things people said about warriors with that kind of reputation, and even if half of it was exaggeration, the other half was still considerable. Yash could not name a champion. The Bloodright, when issued against a chieftess directly, had to be answered by the chieftess herself. That was the law. Merritt told Clayton all of this at the hall that evening, in the same rapid-fire delivery she used for all critical information, and then she said, "She's going to fight Breck tomorrow morning," and then she looked at Clayton like she was waiting for him to say something meaningful. "She's good," Clayton said. "He's killed 14 people," Merritt said. "She's better than good," Clayton said, which was true and also felt inadequate in a way that sat badly in his stomach for the rest of the evening. He found Yash on the wall that night. She was there before him, sitting with her back to the sea drop, facing inland toward the keep lights, and she had a piece of steel in her hands that she was testing the edge on with her thumbnail, which told him she was thinking about something else. He sat beside her. "Tell me about Breck," he said. "He is strong," she said. "He favors a heavy downward attack and he uses his size to push. He has won most of his duels in the first exchange because he is faster than he looks and he commits completely to the opening strike. How do you beat that? You survive the opening strike," she said, "and you make him overextend and then you take his balance. He is large. Large fighters overcommit. I have been smaller than every opponent I have ever fought. I am still here." "You will win," he said. She looked at him. "You say that with conviction." "I forge steel," he said. "I know what strong looks like. You are strong." Something moved in her face. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she had not done before. It was a different kind of touch, quieter, and it meant something. He put his arm around her and they sat above the sea for a long time without speaking. "I am not afraid of the fight," she said eventually. "I am afraid of what it means if I lose. Not for me, for the people I am responsible for." The Frostwolves under Korek would be absorbed and stripped and worked into his war machine, and everything my mother built would be gone inside of 2 years. "Then do not lose," he said. She laughed, a real laugh, and turned her face against his shoulder for a moment. "Excellent tactical advice. Noted. I'm a bladesmith, not a general." "No," she said, lifting her head and looking at him with those amber eyes in the moonlight. "But you are mine, and that matters more than you know." He felt that in his chest like a struck chord. He turned and kissed her forehead, which was not something he had done before either, and she closed her eyes for a breath, and when she opened them she looked like someone who had just been given something she had not known to ask for. Dawn came with a gray, cold light and a sea wind that carried the smell of rain somewhere out on the water, not yet arrived. The main courtyard of Coldspire Keep filled with every living soul in the settlement, by the time the horizon went from black to charcoal, because nothing short of a direct order to leave would have kept these people away. Merritt was there. Alderman Horick was there, wearing his chain of office and looking like a man who wished he were anywhere else. The 11 Frostwolf warriors stood to the east of the central space in a close, watchful line. The 20 Stonecliff had arranged themselves to the west, with Korek at their center and Breck standing slightly forward, a massive figure in banded iron armor with a flanged mace that looked like it had been designed to end arguments permanently. Clayton was at the edge of the north side, near the forge door, with a clear line of sight to the whole scene. Drath stepped forward and issued the challenge in the formal language, which Horik had a translated copy of and read along with in a murmur. The terms were a full blood right, combat until one party yields or cannot rise, no weapons other than those brought to ground, no interference. Yash stepped forward and accepted in a voice that carried across every corner of the courtyard without effort, clean and absolute. She had her new axes. She carried one in each hand, held low, and she was wearing the same fitted leather she had arrived in, the laced bodice and buckled boots and iron plate skirt, and she stood in the early gray light looking like something carved from the cliff itself, built to be here, in this place, doing exactly this. Breck smiled. It was not a kind smile. They squared off in the center of the courtyard, and the crowd went so quiet Clayton could hear the sea below the cliff. Breck attacked first, which was exactly what Yash had predicted, and he was fast. He covered the ground between them in 2 strides and brought the mace down in a diagonal blow that would have broken her shoulder if it landed. She was not there when it landed. She stepped inside and to the left with a lateral speed that drew a sound from the crowd, and the first axe scored along the side of Breck's armor, not a killing blow but a contact, a message, "I can reach you." Breck adjusted. He was not stupid. He circled and came again, lower this time, going for the legs, and she took it on the haft of the left axe, and the impact drove her back 2 steps, and the crowd heard the crack of it and winced collectively. She shook the left hand out, not broken, just struck, and her eyes never left him. The next 3 exchanges were brutal and precise. Breck was trying to wear her down with mass and force, and she was letting him spend energy on air, and occasionally traded those glancing contacts, scoring against his armor without committing to a full power strike, because a full power strike would cost her the positioning she needed. Clayton recognized what she was doing with the structural clarity of someone who thinks in terms of materials under stress. She was letting him exhaust his momentum cycle, the way a good blade weathers the first hard test and then finds its edge after. Breck got a real strike in on the 4th exchange, the haft of the mace catching her across the ribs on the right side, and she went sideways and down on one knee, and the crowd made a sound, and Clayton's hands closed on the forge doorframe and he made himself stand still. She rose. Her face showed nothing. She raised the right axe. Breck came in confident now, changing his timing, and that was exactly what she had been waiting for. She read the change, stepped into it rather than away from it, caught his mace arm at the peak of its swing with both hands on her left axe handle, and used his own rotational force to pull him past her. And as he overcorrected, the right axe came around in a controlled arc, and the flat of it hit him behind the knee with enough force that he staggered and went down. She was on him before he could recover, one knee on his mace arm, the edge of the right axe at his throat. The courtyard was completely silent. Breck did not yield immediately. He tested the hold and she increased the pressure, and then he said in a voice that cost him something visible, "Yield." Yash stood up. She stepped back. She raised the right axe once, clean and unhurried, not a celebration, a statement. The Frostwolf warriors made a sound that Clayton felt in his sternum. Korik's face was a stone wall with something boiling behind it. He made a short, sharp gesture and said something in the formal language that Alderman Horik read from his paper in a hurry, and then announced that the challenge had been met in full and the Frostwolf chieftainship was confirmed. Horik sounded genuinely relieved. Drath, throughout all of this, had not moved. He stood behind Korik with the careful stillness of someone who understood that he was, at this moment, watching his options close. He was maybe 30, lean and dark, with an old scar on his left hand, and he stood there with that particular expression of someone who has made a series of decisions that seemed reasonable individually, and only reveal their catastrophic collective shape at moments exactly like this one. Yash did not look at him during the fight. She looked at him now. She walked across the courtyard toward Korek, and Drath straightened slightly, and everyone watched, and she stopped 10 feet from Korek and spoke directly to him in the formal language. Horik translated in real time. The Frostwolf clan owes the Stonecliff no further consideration on this matter. The blood right has been answered. I recognize your witnessing and no other debt between us. If you wish to discuss border territory in good faith in the future, send a formal herald. Do not bring fighters to my door again. Korek looked at her for a long time. Then he inclined his head fractionally, and it was enough. He turned and walked out, and his 20 went with him, and Drath went with them, and the north gate swallowed them up, and the crowd in the courtyard began to breathe again. And then Yash turned and looked across the courtyard to where Clayton stood at the forge door, and even at 60 feet he could see her expression clearly composed on the surface, with something beneath it that was vast and tired and needing rest, and her eyes found his and stayed on them for a long breath. He opened the forge door wider, which was not a grand gesture, but it was a clear one. Come here. She came. Inside the forge, she set both axes on the workbench, and he watched her hands shake very slightly for just a moment, the first time they had done so, and she stood with her back to him for a breath. You're hurt, he said. The ribs. They are bruised, she said, not broken. Let me see. She turned, and he came forward without waiting for more permission than the fact that she had not said no, and she lifted her arm, and he pressed careful fingers along her right ribcage, and she did not flinch, but her breath changed slightly when he found the worst of it. Bruised, he agreed, but hard bruised. You need binding and rest. I need neither, she said, and then when he gave her a flat look, she said, I need both, but not immediately. Yash. She looked at him, and something in his using her name plainly, without title or formality, seemed to land on her. Let me bind it, he said, and then you can go be the chieftess for however long you need to be. But let me do this first. She sat on the anvil block, which was the only surface in the forge that approximated a seat, and held her arm up and let him work. He had linen in the supply box, and he knew roughly what he was doing. You learn to wrap injuries in a trade that occasionally involved missing a grip and catching a hot edge. He worked carefully, making sure the binding was tight enough to support without restricting breathing, and she sat very straight and let him, and the silence between them was full of everything that had just happened in the courtyard and everything that had been building between them for days. You were watching, she said, not accusing, just observing. The whole time. Were you frightened for me? He tied off the binding and looked up at her. They were close. Yes, he said simply. She put her hand on his face, just rested it there against his jaw, her palm warm and real and steady, and he felt her look at him the way she had in the morning 3 days ago, like she was memorizing something important. No one has been frightened for me in a long time, she said. My warriors respect me. My clan needs me. But being needed is not the same as she stopped. No, he said, it is not. She drew him in and kissed him with the same directness she used for everything, and with something underneath it that was new. That was the direct product of the morning's danger, and the morning's fear, and the morning's winning, and the bind on her ribs, and the fact that he had been at the door watching every second of it and had not looked away. He kissed her back with everything he had, because she was alive and upright and here, and she was choosing him again, as clearly and simply as the sun choosing to rise, and he was so grateful for it that it filled the whole forge. The talk about what had happened in the courtyard lasted the better part of 3 days. The fight itself was one subject. The formality and sheer physical authority of Yash's win over a fighter of Breck's size and reputation made a very good story and improved in the telling, until by the 3rd day, Breck had apparently had actual horns, and she had fought him blindfolded. Clayton heard 5 different versions in the hall and did not correct any of them. But the other subject, the one that had merit incandescent with delight and old Horik politely uncertain, and half the settlement arguing across dinner tables, was what had happened in the week leading up to the fight, because people had watched. That was the nature of a settlement of 300 souls on a cliff above the sea. There were very few private places, and the forge was not one of them, and the wall above the cliff was not one of them, and the walk from the forge door to the courtyard and back again had been observed with the particular attention that only a small, intensely bored community can bring to bear on its most interesting residents. People had seen her at the forge door at dawn. People had drawn conclusions. The delightfully scandalous version, which was the one that spread fastest, was told by a fisherman named Galt, who claimed to have seen them on the wall the night before the duel, sitting against each other, and who described the scene in terms normally reserved for dramatic bardic performance. Yash, hearing a version of this from one of her warriors who had been told by someone at the hall, came to the forge on the evening of the second day and stood in the doorway with her arms crossed. "They are saying interesting things," she said. "Merritt has thoughts on interior decorating that she hasn't actually been asked for," Clayton said, not looking up from the hinge he was filing. In the same way, she walked in and sat on the edge of the workbench. "Does it trouble you what they say?" He set the file down and looked at her directly. "Does it trouble you?" She considered this for a moment. "No," she said, "but I want to know if it troubles you, because if it does, that is something to talk about." He walked over to where she was sitting and stood in front of her. She looked up at him with those amber eyes, and he put both hands on the workbench on either side of her, which put them at roughly the same level. "It does not trouble me," he said, "that people know I have feelings for you. What would trouble me is if you thought I wanted to keep it quiet because of what you are." Something in her face shifted, opened a little. "Most humans would," she said. "I'm not most humans," he said. She looked at him for a long time. Then she reached out and caught the front of his shirt in her fist, the same gesture as the first night on the wall, and pulled him in, and kissed him with a warmth that was different from the fierce need of the morning after the duel. This was something settled and deliberate, a statement of continuation rather than urgency. When she drew back, she said, "Good, because I was not planning to keep it quiet either." What followed was, in fact, not quiet. On the third day after the Stonecliff departure, Yash walked into the Hall Tavern at midday, sat down at a table with Clayton and Merritt as naturally as if she had been doing it for years, and ate lunch and laughed at something Merritt said about Alderman Horrocks' expression during the duel. And when Clayton refilled her cup from the communal pitcher, she caught his hand briefly as he set it down. Just a moment of contact, easy and real. The entire hall saw it. By dinner, the story had evolved into the bladesmith and the Orc Chieftess being madly in love, which was, to be fair, increasingly accurate. Horrocks came to see Clayton at the forge the next morning. He was a decent man, Horrocks 60 years old, practical, not unkind, and considerably more diplomatically capable than his nervous expression suggested. "I want to speak plainly," Horrocks said, "because I respect you and I think you'll take it the right way." "Go ahead," Clayton said. "There are some in the settlement who are uncomfortable with the situation, not the majority, but some. They feel that having a prominent association between one of our people and an Orc Chieftess, particularly in the immediate aftermath of a clan succession fight that brought armed warriors to our courtyard, might create ongoing complications." "Complications," Clayton said. "Political ones. Territorial ones. If the Frostwolf clan's interests become entangled with Coldspire's through a personal relationship, it changes the nature of our neutrality." Clayton set down the file he was holding. He thought about how to say the next thing carefully, because Horrocks was trying to be fair and he wanted to meet that fairly. "Alderman," he said, "Yash Frostwolf came here for a legal business commission and chose this settlement for a formal legal process that she paid for and conducted without violence to a single Coldspire resident. She is currently here because her camp is here for the duration of the formal period following the blood rite. In 2 weeks she'll break camp and ride north to her clan territory. Whether I have feelings for her or not, the timeline is the same." Horrocks nodded slowly. "And after that 2 weeks, that's between me and her," Clayton said. Horrocks nodded again, with the expression of a man who had asked the question he needed to ask and received the answer he had expected. He left without pressing it further, and Clayton stood at the forge and felt the weight of what the alderman had not quite said. After she leaves, what then? He did not have an answer for that yet. That evening he told Yash about the conversation, because it seemed important to be honest. She listened with her face very still, sitting across the small table in the forge room where they had taken to sharing evening meals, one of her warriors usually stationed outside as a matter of clan protocol. "He is not entirely wrong," she said when he finished. "Political entanglements are real. I have complicated your neutrality." "You have complicated various things," he said. "I find I don't mind." She looked at him. "Clayton, when I leave in 2 weeks, I am going north to Frostwolf territory. It will be months of work, consolidating what the Ironmaw betrayal loosened, resecuring the borders, rebuilding the trust in the camp leadership. It will not be a simple life." "I didn't think it would be." "I am saying it will be difficult," she said, with something careful and deliberate in her voice, as if she was trying to hand him something he could refuse. "And I am asking if you want to know more before you decide anything." He leaned his forearms on the table toward her. "Yash, do you want me to come with you?" She looked at him with those amber eyes and said nothing for a long moment. Then, "More than I have wanted most things." "Then I am coming," he said. "The forge here is rented. My tools travel. I've been a bladesmith without a permanent forge before. I can do it again. Your clan will need someone who can maintain their weapons, and I can maintain weapons." He paused. "And I want to be where you are." She reached across the table and put her hand on his, flat and warm and deliberate. "I want you to know what you are agreeing to," she said. "My clan is not always welcoming to outsiders, particularly human outsiders." "Are they welcoming to outsiders who make good axes?" Her expression did something complicated and then resolved into a smile. A real one, full and open, the kind she had been letting through more often now, and it transformed her face the way dawn transforms a coastline, and he thought he would happily spend a very long time finding reasons to put that expression on her face. "They will learn to be," she said. The week that followed was both the busiest and the most vivid of Clayton's recent memory. He spent the mornings at the forge finishing outstanding commissions and packing his tools into the traveling cases he had not opened in 2 years. The hammer roll, the tong rack, the portable anvil block that was too heavy for one person to lift without a harness. He spent the afternoons in the Frostwolf camp, learning the names of her warriors and letting them learn his, which was a careful social process that happened largely through Yash's deliberate inclusion of him in camp routines. Gren, her senior fighter, was the most direct about it. He watched Clayton for 2 full days with the focused attention of someone conducting a long assessment. And then on the 3rd day, he handed Clayton a bowl of camp stew without being asked and said, in heavily accented common tongue, "You are not useless," which Yash later translated as approximately the highest compliment Gren had given a non-warrior since she had known him. On the 10th evening, with the departure 4 days away, something happened that neither of them had planned for. It happened in the hall, because things of that particular nature always seem to happen in halls. The Stonecliff group had not fully left the region. Korik had departed with his main party, but 2 of his riders had remained in the coastal town 5 miles north, the kind of lingering that had a specific professional character to it. Clayton had noticed them once at the edge of Coldspire 2 days after the departure and marked their faces and said nothing, because he had not been certain what they were doing, and he did not want to raise an alarm based on faces. On the 10th evening, one of them appeared in the hall. He was a Stonecliff orc, clearly, from the clan marks on his armor, and he came in with the careful posture of someone who wants to be noticed doing something benign, and he sat at the bar and ordered ale, and looked around the room with the easy, unhurried attention of someone who is waiting for something specific. Yash was there, 2 tables from the bar, talking with Gren and the settlement's chandler about supply prices along the northern road. She saw him the moment he came in. Clayton, at the bar getting refills, saw her see him. The Stonecliff warrior waited until Yash was returning from the back of the hall and moved to intersect her path. He had clearly timed it precisely. He said something in the clan language, short and direct, and his tone was not aggressive, but the content was clearly important because Yash stopped walking. Clayton was at the bar. He had a clear line of sight. The warrior reached into his jacket and produced a folded document vellum, official-looking, with a wax seal, and held it out to Yash. She did not take it immediately. Her chin came up. The warrior spoke again, and Clayton heard one word in common: challenge. Yash took the document, broke the seal, read it. Her face was perfectly still. Then she set it on the nearest table face up, and looked at the Stonecliff warrior with an expression of such absolute sovereign calm that the man actually took a half-step back. Clayton moved to the table and looked at the document. He could read common script adequately, and Yash, seeing him look, translated the relevant passage. Orc challenges the blood-right verdict on procedural grounds. He has filed with the regional compact that the fight was conducted on neutral rather than clan ground, which his compact advocates claim invalidates it. He is requesting a second formal challenge on Stonecliff home ground within 30 days. The hall had gone very quiet. Everyone who had been in the courtyard 10 days ago was listening. "Is the procedural claim valid?" Clayton asked. "It is arguable," Yash said. "The old laws do not definitively specify ground ownership. His compact advocates will claim that neutral ground disadvantages the challenger. It is weak, but it will take months to argue through the formal compact channels, and during those months my chieftainship is technically in dispute, which means I cannot make binding agreements or levy resources." The Stonecliff warrior, apparently satisfied that the message had been delivered, began moving toward the door. And then Yash said, loudly enough for the entire hall to hear, "Tell Korek that I accept no procedural challenge from a man who fought through a proxy champion and lost. Tell him that if he wants to dispute my chieftainship, he can come himself to Frostwolf ground and say it to my face under the full laws, and I will answer in kind." The warrior stopped at the door. The hall was absolutely still. The warrior said something short and left. Yash stood in the middle of the hall with the vellum document in her hand, and 300 years of human-orc tension crackling through the room like lightning looking for ground. And every person in that hall was staring at her, and a lot of them were frightened, and a lot of them were awed, and Merritt behind the bar looked like she was trying to contain her own heartbeat. Clayton walked up to Yash, stood at her shoulder, and said, at a normal conversational volume that was nonetheless pitched to carry in the silence, "Well, that seems settled." Her head turned toward him, and the amber eyes held his, and the corner of her mouth moved, and the tension in the room shifted, not dissolved but changed, into something that was no longer frightened. Several people laughed, short and slightly high-pitched, the laugh of people releasing something held too tightly, and Merritt said, "Round of grain ale on the house because we have all earned it," and the hall began to breathe again. But something had changed in the political weather, and they both knew it. Back in the forge quarters that night, she sat on the edge of the sleeping frame with the vellum in her hand and her face unguarded in the way it was only for him, and he sat beside her and read the document again more carefully. "He will keep doing this," she said. "As long as he can find procedural grounds, he will keep filing challenges. It will cost him almost nothing, and it will cost me constant attention." "Is there a way to close it permanently?" Clayton asked. She was quiet for a moment. "There is one way," she said. "Under the old compact law, a chieftess who holds Frostwolf ground for an uninterrupted season while discharging all clan duties is considered entrenched, and the chieftainship challenge window closes. Korek knows this. That is why the timing matters. He wants to use the 30 days before I reach Frostwolf territory. If I am delayed, he can claim I never established residency." "Then we cannot afford to be delayed," Clayton said. "No," she said. "We leave in 3 days instead of 4. And we travel fast." She looked at the document again, and he watched her think, watched her process it with the same efficiency she brought to combat, stripping it to essentials, finding the action underneath the threat. He found watching her mind work as compelling as anything else about her, and that was saying something. "I have a question," he said. She looked at him. "When we get to Frostwolf territory," he said, "what am I to you there? I want to know how you want to handle it so I don't do something wrong by accident." She was quiet. Then she said, "Under Frostwolf custom, a chieftess's chosen companion has a specific designation. It is not a political rank. It does not grant authority over clan decisions. It means that you are in my household and under my protection, and the clan owes you the same courtesy they owe any member of that household." She paused. "It also means that challenging you is challenging me, which has specific consequences under the law." "And you would name me that," he said. "Your chosen companion." "I already think of you as that," she said, in a voice very quiet and direct. "I have for several days. I have been deciding when to say it." He took the vellum from her hand and set it on the floor and took her hand in both of his. She let him. She looked down at their joined hands with that careful, wondering expression she had not quite been able to hide since the first night on the wall. "Then say it now," he said. She raised her eyes to his. "You are my chosen," she said. In the keep with the sea wind through the shutters and the forge coals cooling in the room below, it was as simple and absolute as any vow Clayton had ever imagined, and it landed in him like a blade finding home. He kissed her, pulling her in, and she came to him with a warmth and an openness that was the truest thing he had felt in years. And they stayed that way for a long time while the wind worked at the shutters and the sea ran on below the cliff. They left Coldspire 2 mornings later. Merritt was at the gate at dawn, which was not surprising. She hugged Clayton with the frank ferocity of a woman who would not say she was going to miss someone but absolutely was, and then she looked at Yash and said, "You had better be good to him." And Yash, who was already mounted on the gray riding horse she had arrived on, looked down at Merritt with an expression that was somewhere between amused and genuinely moved. "Better than good," Yash said, which was exactly the right answer. Horik was at the gate too, in his official capacity, and he shook Clayton's hand and gave Yash a formal nod and said, "Coldspire's gates are open to both of you always," and meant it, and Clayton thought the old alderman might be more interesting than he had given him credit for. The Frostwolf camp broke with military precision, and by the time the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge they were moving north on the coastal road, 11 warriors and 2 newcomers, with the gray sea on their left and the sky wide and salt clean above them. Clayton rode a borrowed horse, one of the Frostwolf's spares, a steady dark animal that tolerated his imperfect horsemanship with philosophical patience, and Yash rode beside him at the head of the column. And the morning was cold and clear and the road was good, and for the first time in perhaps years he felt something he identified slowly as not alone, not just accompanied, not just employed or useful or proximate to other people, actually, genuinely not alone. He told her this somewhere around midday, because the road was empty and the wind was down, and it seemed like the kind of thing she should know. She listened to him say it, and then she reached across the space between their horses and put her hand on his arm for a moment. "Good," she said, "because you never will be again, not while I am breathing." And that was that, simply and absolutely. The northern road took 6 days through terrain that shifted from coastal scrub to deep pine forest to the open rolling highland that marked the edge of Frostwolf territory, and in those 6 days several things happened. The first was that Clayton began to learn the clan language in earnest. Gren turned out to be a surprisingly patient teacher, possibly because he had decided at some point that Clayton was worth the effort, and Clayton had always been quick with patterns, which the clan language was built on inflections that changed meaning by tone and placement, a logical internal structure that rewarded analytical thinking. By the 4th day, he could exchange basic information, and by the 6th day, he could follow the outline of conversations even when they moved fast. The second was that the potential Stonecliff pursuit they had been watching for did not materialize as an overt attack. They were tracked. Gren identified signs of riders paralleling their route on the 2nd day, and Yash altered their path twice to make the tracking more difficult, which it seemed to do, but no engagement came. Korek apparently had enough political caution to avoid an open confrontation on the road when the procedural challenge was still his primary weapon. The third thing was that somewhere between the forest and the highland, on a cold, clear night with a fire and a sky full of stars, and the pine smell in everything, Clayton and Yash had a long conversation about what they were building together. It started practically. How would the forge work in the Frostwolf camp? What was available in terms of materials and fuel? What the clan most needed in terms of blade work? And then it grew into something more layered and honest. She told him about her mother, a woman named Kaya, who had been a brilliant political mind in a body destroyed too young by a fever that should have been survivable with better healers and better luck, and whose death had left Yash with a role she had spent most of her life preparing for, but had not expected to hold at 24. He told her about his master, an old bladesmith named Orc who had been cold and exacting and never once said that Clayton was good at the work, but who had also left him the best tools in his kit when he retired, which Clayton had eventually decided was the same as a compliment in a different language. "He sounds like Gren," Yash said. "Exactly like Gren," Clayton said. She was lying with her head on his shoulder, and the fire between them and the stars above and his arm around her, and the pine forest breathing in the dark. And he thought he had been in genuinely beautiful places before, but this was the most beautiful by a significant margin, because she was in it. "What were you like before this?" she asked. "Before Coldspire." "Quieter," he said, "more in my own head." "Were you happy?" "I was functional," he said, which was the most accurate answer. "I had the work. The work was good, but I went whole weeks without talking to anyone except about business, and I had told myself that was fine because I preferred my own company." He paused. "And then I met you, and I discovered that what I had told myself was fine was actually just the least painful version of not having what I wanted." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I understand that. I have been very good at being necessary, very good at being the one others depend on. And for a long time I told myself that being needed was enough, because needing someone yourself is a vulnerability in my position." She turned her face up toward him. "You make me want to be vulnerable." He kissed her forehead and she closed her eyes. "Then be," he said. "I have you." She made a low sound against him that was not quite language and was entirely sufficient. On the 6th day they crossed into Frostwolf territory. The clan camp was larger than Clayton had expected, perhaps 150 people living in a combination of permanent structures and winter tents, built against a hillside with a good natural defensive position, and a stream running through it and the smell of cookfires everywhere. There was a central hall, lower than Coldspire's but similarly structured, a long stone and timber building that served as meeting room and communal eating space, and in emergencies, medical center. The arrival of Yash with her party produced a response that Clayton watched with care, trying to read it. There was relief visible and physical, people's shoulders dropping, the quality of movement changing. And then there was curiosity directed at him, frank and measuring, the kind that had nothing hostile in it but was entirely unwilling to pretend it wasn't happening. Yash dismounted in the center of camp and addressed the assembled clan in the formal register. Clayton could follow enough to know the shape of it, the blood right, the win, the return, and then something more deliberate, paced differently, that he heard enough of to understand was the formal naming. She said his name in the common pronunciation and the clan designation for chosen companion in the same sentence, twice, clearly and without hesitation, and there was a silence and then a sound of collective acknowledgement. Gren, standing beside Clayton, said without looking at him, "She has named you to the clan. Now you are ours." He paused. "Try not to be an embarrassment." "I'll do my best," Clayton said. Gren almost smiled. The forge situation was sorted out within a week. There was an existing structure in the camp that had been used for metalwork, small, old, with a chimney that needed rebuilding and a bellows that needed replacing. And Clayton set to work on it with the systematic efficiency that was his primary mode. He pulled the old chimney down to the stone, rebuilt it wider to handle the heat load he needed, replaced the bellows mechanism himself, and had a functional forge fire running by the 8th day. He was burning charcoal from the camp's supply, which was adequate but not ideal, and he made a note to establish a consistent supply chain once the seasonal road to the southern market town was reliably open again. He worked on the clan's weapons first, a triage of blade conditions that turned up 17 pieces needing serious attention, from bent spear points to a cracked sword that someone had been using anyway, which he repaired and returned with a short, sharp lecture in broken clan language that Gren, watching from the doorway, seemed to find amusing. The clan's reaction to Clayton evolved in a way that felt honest rather than performed. The warriors who had been with Yash at Coldspire had already formed their assessment and were quietly, informally, vouching for him by way of behavior, including him in conversation, consulting him casually about their weapons, the kind of social endorsement that required no announcement because it was visible in the daily texture of things. The rest of the camp watched and evaluated, and slowly, one by one, they came to the forge with questions or commissions or sometimes just to watch him work, which he did not mind. There was one warrior, a woman named Sova, who was openly skeptical for the first 3 weeks. She was Yash's age, fast and technically brilliant with a pair of matched short swords, and she watched Clayton with the focused attention of someone waiting for him to reveal his actual purpose. He did not confront it. He just worked. He stayed consistent. He spoke to people in their language as best he could. He did not try to position himself as anything other than what he was. On the 22nd day, Sova came to the forge and put her short swords on the workbench without a word. He examined them and saw immediately that the matching hilt guards had been ground down at some point to save weight, a previous modification that had compromised the cross-section geometry. He could fix them. He told her this in the clan language with hand gestures filling in the gaps, and she watched him work for 2 hours without speaking, and when he handed them back with the guard geometry corrected and the edges freshly set, she took them and ran the standard testing movements and then stopped and looked at him. "Better," she said in common. "I know," he said. She left. The next day she told someone something that he did not catch, but that made that person look at him differently, and he decided to take that as progress. The Korek situation resolved itself in a way that was neither dramatic nor anticlimactic, but had a specific satisfying quality. On the 32nd day after their arrival in Frostwolf territory, 2 days past the compact window that would have allowed a valid procedural challenge, a formal messenger arrived from the Regional Compact Authority, with a document confirming that Yash Frostwolf's chieftainship was entrenched under seasonal residency provisions, and that no further challenge mechanism was available to the Stonecliff clan, without proof of a specific clan law violation. Korek had in fact filed the procedural challenge, which the compact had reviewed and rejected on the grounds that the neutral ground selection had been agreed to by both parties before the fight, which invalidated the procedural objection. Yash read the document at the central hall table with 6 of her senior warriors around her, and Clayton at the end of the table with the breakfast they had been having when the messenger arrived. And when she finished, she set it down and said, simply, "It is done." The room was quiet for a moment, and then Gren said something in the clan language that made everyone laugh, including Clayton, because he had caught enough to know it was something blunt and slightly rude about Korek's dignity. And Yash laughed too, the full, open laugh that she had been giving more freely in the weeks since Coldspire, the one that changed her whole face, and that he could not look at without feeling something warm and unguarded in himself. She looked across the table at him, still laughing, and he raised his cup toward her, and she raised hers back, and that was the real end of it. In the weeks that followed, without the Stonecliff threat pressing on everything, the camp settled into the rhythms of a community finding its footing after strain. Yash spent her days in the practical work of leadership arbitrating disputes, coordinating with neighboring groups, planning supply routes for the coming season, doing the sustained, unglamorous work of keeping 150 people safe and fed and purposeful. Clayton worked the forge. He was good at it, and people knew he was good at it, and the quiet social currency of usefulness accumulated around him, without his having to engineer it. In the evenings they were together in the way of two people who had found each other's company indispensable, talking through the days, making each other laugh, sitting together in a warmth that was both domestic and charged, because the chemistry between them had not faded in the slightest with proximity, and showed no signs of doing so. She was direct about wanting him in the way she was direct about everything, which he found wonderful and slightly dizzy-making, and was happy to be direct back about. They moved through the private spaces of their shared quarters with an ease that felt like something that had always existed and was simply being accessed now. He learned her in the way that mattered, not just her body, which was extraordinary and responsive and strong, but her patterns, her habits, the particular silence she went into when she was working through something difficult, and the different silence she went into when she was content. He learned that she woke earlier than almost anyone in camp and spent the first hour alone with tea in the morning, which was a private ritual she did not give up for anyone, but which she had begun leaving the door open during, which he understood as an invitation of a specific kind, not to intrude, but to be available. He began making the tea. She noticed the first time he did it and said nothing, just looked at him over the cup with those amber eyes and then looked out at the morning, and the silence between them was entirely full. He learned that she was harder on herself than on anyone in her camp, and that she carried the weight of her responsibilities with a stoicism that was genuine but occasionally needed to be set down, and that she was most likely to let herself set it down with him and only with him, in the small hours of the night when the camp was quiet and there was no performance required. He learned to be the place she set it down, and he did not find it a burden. He found it, in fact, the greatest thing anyone had ever trusted him with. She learned him in return. She learned that he needed quiet working time the way some people need food, and she created it for him without being asked by managing the forge's foot traffic to give him uninterrupted hours when he needed them. She learned that he was prone to overworking when he was preoccupied, and that the way to stop him was not to tell him to stop, but to put food in front of him, because he would never refuse food while working, but would refuse a direct instruction to rest. She learned that he was genuinely, constitutionally kind, not performing it, not strategically deploying it, but built with it as a base material, and that this was not weakness, was in fact the rarest kind of strength, and she stopped cataloging ways it might be a vulnerability and started simply receiving it. On a morning in the 5th week, Yash came to the forge during the midday break and stood watching him work with an expression he had not seen before, something slightly solemnly considering. He set the work down. "What is it?" "I want to do the full clan claiming," she said, "not just the designation I gave the camp on arrival, the full ceremony. With the fox-tooth exchange and the blood binding." He knew what this was. He had been learning, and he had asked about the ceremony several weeks ago in a conversation that had been ostensibly academic and was not at all academic, and she had explained it with the careful precision she brought to important things. The full claiming was permanent, under Frostwolf law. It was the equivalent of a bond oath, not marriage in the human sense, not a ceremony for the benefit of others, but a direct, bilateral, witnessed oath between two people that designated them each other's in the fullest legal and social sense. It could not be undone by a third party's decision or a political calculation. It ended only if both people chose to end it. When, he said. "Now," she said, "if you want." "Now," he agreed without hesitation, and her face did that thing again, the careful, wondering expression that he now recognized as her version of being undone. It happened in the central hall, which was the traditional space for it, with Gren and Sova and 4 others as witnesses, which were more witnesses than the law required but was, he understood, a political statement as much as a personal one, a public acknowledgement, in front of the senior warriors and the people whose respect mattered, that this was real and deliberate and being done fully. The ceremony was simple. They stood facing each other and she spoke the claiming in the formal register of the clan language, her chosen, her household, the words that meant, "I have decided on you and I do not undecide." He spoke the response, which he had practiced, in the same language, imperfectly but clearly enough, and the witnesses heard it and acknowledged it. They exchanged the fox teeth, hers from the cord in her hair, the one she had been wearing when she walked into his forge, and his the new one she pressed into his palm before the ceremony, pale ivory, freshly worked, which she had made herself, which undid him slightly. The blood binding was a small cut on each palm, pressed together and held a physical oath, the kind that cost something that the body would remember. He held her hand in his and felt her pulse and the warmth of her and the slight sting in his palm, and thought that he would carry this mark the way he carried every good scar, as evidence of something real. Gren said something that Clayton caught. "Good match." From Gren, this was the same as a standing ovation. Sova was crying very slightly and appeared furious about it, which Clayton found so charming that he had to look away to avoid laughing. Yash was looking at him. Just him. The amber eyes were bright and full and her hand was still pressed against his, and she said in common for him, "You are mine. I am yours." "You are mine," he said. "I am yours." 3 weeks later, the Stonecliff situation resolved itself in the most complete and least expected way. Korek came north, not with warriors, with a single formal herald and a request for a meeting under compact authority, which meant both parties were obligated by law to attend. Yash and Clayton and Gren rode to the compact meeting point, a waystone on the Highland Road, neutral ground used for treaty conferences, and found Korek there with his herald and, unexpectedly, Drath Ironmaw. Drath was not in Stonecliff armor. He was in traveling clothes, and he had the look of a man who had spent a difficult several weeks in a situation that had not improved. He stood slightly apart from Korek with the careful posture of someone who is not sure what reception to expect. Korek, as it turned out, was not there to issue another challenge. He was there to negotiate a border agreement, because in the week since Yash's entrenchment had been confirmed, 2 things had changed his calculations. The regional compact had levied a formal warning against the Stonecliff clan for the repeated challenge attempts, and 2 other neighboring clans who had been watching the situation had both quietly signaled support for the Frostwolf position. Korek was pragmatic in the way that powerful men become pragmatic when the political math stops working in their favor. He proposed a formal border treaty, clear territorial lines, no encroachment on fishing routes, a mutual non-aggression agreement with compact oversight. Yash listened to the full proposal with Gren translating where her formal legal vocabulary ran short, and she asked 3 direct questions and received answers that were mostly satisfactory, and then she negotiated 2 amendments that improved the fishing route protections, and then she accepted it. It was, Clayton thought, watching from slightly behind and to her right, one of the most effective pieces of work he had ever seen done. She had managed a crisis that had begun with a betrayal, moved through a near-violent succession challenge, survived a sustained procedural campaign, and resolved it in a formal treaty that left her clan in a better position than before Drath's defection, which was, by any measure, a remarkable outcome. The treaty was signed in compact form and witnessed by the herald. After Korek and the herald had left, Drath remained. He stood at the waystone with his hat in his hands, which was not a Frostwolf custom, but was apparently the posture he had defaulted to when he had nothing else. Yash looked at him for a long time. Clayton watched her face. "Why did Korek bring you?" she said. "Didn't," Drath said. "I requested to come. He allowed it because it cost him nothing." He was looking at her steadily. "I wanted to say it to your face. What I did was wrong, not strategically wrong, morally wrong. You trusted me and I used that trust as a weapon and I have not been comfortable since." He paused. "I do not expect forgiveness. I know better than to ask for it. I wanted you to know that I know what it was." Yash was quiet for a long moment. "I know you know," she said finally. "I have known you long enough to know that you would not be comfortable." She looked at him. "I cannot take you back. The clan cannot trust you and I cannot ask them to." She paused. "I will not hunt you. You may go where you choose. Do not return to Frostwolf territory without sending a herald first." Drath nodded. He did not say thank you, which was the right call. She was not offering forgiveness, and thanking her for something she had not offered would have been false. He just nodded and walked north, and that was the last of him. Yash stood at the waystone for a moment after he had gone, looking at the road. Then she turned and looked at Clayton. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. She looked across the highland, and the sky was enormous above them, blue and cold and sharp, and she threw her head back and laughed. It was sudden and full and real, and it broke over the highland like weather, and it pulled him in like weather, and he started laughing too. Both of them laughing at the waystone in the cold highland air with the treaty signed, and the Stonecliff threat finished, and Drath walking away into the distance, and all of it over. Finally and completely over. And the laughing was the release of everything that had been held tense since the morning she had walked into his forge doorway like a storm on two legs. Gren, mounted behind them, said something dry and brief in the clan language. Clayton caught it now. "Are you two going to do this all the way back to camp?" "Probably," Clayton called back. Yash, still laughing, turned to him and grabbed his coat front with both hands the way she had grabbed his shirt on the first night at the wall, and pulled him in, and kissed him in the full cold highland light with Gren watching and the signed treaty in the saddlebag and the border resolved and the whole wide sky above them. He kissed her back with his hands in her hair and the foxtooth cord against his fingers, and she tasted like the cold air and like victory, and he thought, This is what being chosen feels like." She drew back and looked at him with the amber eyes full and bright and her breath visible in the cold air, and she said, "Come home." "I am home," he said. "You are home." She held his gaze for a long breath, with that wondering expression that was fully hers now, the one no longer careful about being seen. Then she smiled, the full, open, transforming smile, and released his coat and swung back up onto her horse. He mounted up beside her and they turned south toward the Frostwolf camp, and the highland road was wide and cold and clear, and the sky held every color of a late afternoon in the north. And Gren rode behind them in companionable silence, and they rode side by side, close enough that their knees occasionally touched, and the camp was waiting, and the forge was waiting, and the evening was waiting, and none of it was going anywhere. He had arrived at Coldspire 6 years ago with a set of good tools and a lease on an old monk scriptorium and the private, unacknowledged belief that what he had was fine, that the work was enough, that the sea at night kept the silence from getting too quiet, and that was sufficient. He had forged 1,000 blades in that time and learned the particular satisfaction of metal doing what metal was supposed to do, the way a well-made edge catches light. He thought now that he had been doing the equivalent all along, working and waiting, without fully knowing he was waiting, for something to walk through the door. She had walked through the door looking like a storm and changed the weather permanently, and she was entirely unrepentant about it, and he was glad of every second of it with a depth that sat below language and settled into his bones the way forge heat settles into steel, not on the surface, not temporary but through and through. The camp fire was lit when they rode in. There was food. There were voices. There was the particular community of 150 people who were alive and together in a world that had tried to complicate that considerably. Yash dismounted and handed her horse to the stable hand and turned and looked at Clayton as he swung down beside her, and she reached out and touched the foxtooth at his collar just briefly with one finger. "Come eat," she said. "Yes," he said. They walked into the firelight together.